Space sovereignty rules supreme as the global push continues. France, Germany, Australia, Japan, and South Korea have all made major developments in their respective efforts this year alone, and the decree shows no signs of slowing.
Friends of the show, ISAR Aerospace, have announced the close of a $10 million seed round of funding, which leads a week of several high-profile fundraising announcements and contract awards. It's good to be aware of the hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into SSA and SDA and their potential landing spots.
Blue Origin has announced a wave of new satellites with the Terra Wave project, launching in Q4 of 2027. 5,000 satellites in combined LEO and MEO orbits will provide a fundamentally new model for satellite operations on orbit and continue the rapid increase of satellites launched to orbit.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer.
Here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoy the episode. Drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're receiving this signal. To start us off for the week, Loft Orbital wins a French sovereign SAR contract with CNES and Thales.
Say that 3 times fast.
Well, this increases the trend of independent space sovereignty that we've seen over the past 6 months and the past years. But we've seen this pattern both at the European level through ESA's funding and technical prioritization efforts. We've also seen this at the national level with France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, not even to mention India, all standing up various stages of vertically self-sufficient space technology stacks. This is one of the first prime contracts awarded to a new space company out of Europe. And I believe Loft represents the smallest recipient of such a contract to date. But if you recall, Harrison, the major consortium between Thales, Airbus, and Leonardo, the consortium that OHB was sort of conspicuously missing from, that would have represented a major consortium of all the primes who would have been able to win and execute on this contract entirely on their own. Those four companies all represent different nations, and so this is very much an example of France effectively prioritizing sovereign capability, awarding this contract to Loft, who has to partner with a SAR payload specialist. Loft specializes in the buses themselves, but Loft is not able to satisfy this contract solely off of their own capabilities. But the premium, the priority is so very clearly sovereign capability that they went with Loft anyways. But so either of the major consortiums could have worked. ISAR would have been able to presumably execute on this contract on their own. They're the incumbent sort of SAR darling, if you will, in the industry. But this is very clearly continuing with the national security concerns and defense concerns of sovereign SAR capability, as this contract is awarded by CNES and the DGA, both of which are French defense organizations throughout the country.
Yeah, I think it's it's following a growth in SAR that we've seen recently. Late last year, the U.S. was indicating that there was less interest or appetite for SAR, but we've seen a huge demand for it internationally. As you mentioned, ISAR is kind of the big one. Last week, we saw Japan military invest heavily in Synspective, so they have their own space sovereignty for SAR. Just last week, we announced Array Labs funding, so there is some growing demand again for SAR in the U.S. It just seems across the board that SAR is a real capability that people want to stand up for their country's defense.
Yeah, it very much feels like SAR is one of the quickest and most immediate ways for defense funding to make an impact on national security. And it feels like that is the primary driving force for a lot of this SAR growth. So great to see that wealth sort of being distributed and spread around, so that we're not seeing just one or two major wins throughout everything, but great to see that everybody's getting a chance to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
Additionally, Marble Imaging entered a strategic partnership with French aerospace and technology company Safran Space to include high-performance optical payloads in Marble's upcoming satellite constellation. They procured a Seeing 230 optical payload that will be integrated into their inaugural satellite mission, enabling the acquisition of some very high-resolution multispectral imagery. So this is in a word, this is the European version of Planet Labs, and it's a multispectral AI-empowered laser downlink. So a proliferated constellation for multispectral high-quality imaging that has a decentralized downlink and laser terminal for doing so, very much in line with some of the technology and some of the solutions that we've seen Planet develop and pioneer.
Yeah, beside that laser downlink, that's becoming more common. I mean, Kepler just launched last week, and they're one of the first to do laser downlink for an active satellite. You know, they've demoed it before on other satellites, but it's becoming more of an operational standard for a lot of applications. So I'm doubtful that they can get a laser downlink active on this satellite, but they're not launching anytime that soon, so they have some time to figure it out. And like I said, it's kind of becoming a more mature technology.
Absolutely. UK-based company Open Cosmos was set to launch on Rocket Lab earlier this week, following Lichtenstein's Ka-band grant of spectrum from Rivada Space that we spoke about previously. They were scheduled to launch their first 2 satellites this week. That wound up getting delayed. There was, if memory serves, there was a testing setback on the Electron. I don't think it was on the actual flight pad, but when they were testing the Electron horizontally, there was a setback, if memory serves, and that's gonna push back the launch date for Open Cosmos a little bit. So certainly a bummer for the team, but you find me somebody who would prefer to blow up on the launch pad, and would I love to understand why.
What was the one back the launch like 5 years ago where they thought it was sabotage just so they could get the insurance claim? I think it was the Israeli Space Agency. They had a satellite that if it didn't work out well, they were gonna go out of business. So there, I gave you one.
Yeah, you're right. That's one. The SpaceRise Consortium has initiated the procurement for the IRIS-2 satellite and launch services. IRIS-2 is a military Ka-band constellation, and SpaceRise is primarily SES Eutelsat and Hispasat. So another consortium different from the big major consortium between Airbus, Leonardo, and Thales.
Yeah, although they also have all the companies too. So it's just one big incestuous family over there.
Hey, it takes a village to make a village, I guess. But the ESA member states have additionally pledged 73 million euro towards the further development of HummingSat, which represents the world's first commercial small geosat. And much to my excitement, it's fun to see Geo not dead, different but not dead. And so would love to continue to follow HummingSat and see how they and some of the other new players and new satellite companies playing in the geostationary space and geospatial orbit space wind up solving some of the problems at much more competitive price points that have been more or less prohibitive to date.
Yeah, I think it's a good sign that they're spending so much money on secure communications. They've been pretty reliant on Star Shield, even though that's more tailored for the U.S. military. But you know, it's good that they're dividing their funds between some of the more established stalwart players like SES, Eutelsat, Hispasat, with their depth of experience in telecommunications to build out their military communications constellation, the IRIS² constellation, and then throwing quite a bit of money, 73 million euro, towards a smaller, more up and coming company like Swiss 12 with their HummingSat satellite. I know we reported on it late last year that Swiss 12 had bought several thrusters from some other supplier, and there was speculation that they were going to be building more satellites this year. this seems to be correct given the amount of money they're getting, and it seems to be building up a more geo-focused backbone to European telecommunications, which I wouldn't be surprised if it interplays well with IRIS², since we also reported on the Stranis talking about their secure point-to-point communication system that they're able to isolate on board the spacecraft. I would very much expect SWISTA-12 to establish that same kind of capability, because it would serve as a really good complement to a proliferated LEO constellation of military communications. Building out the backbone of space this week is space infrastructure in several different flavors. The big news for this week is Blue Origin's announcement of the TerraWave project. This is a set of 5,000 proliferated communications satellites that are going to be deployed across low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit. This hybrid design is pretty common with what we've seen with other constellations. Kualwan is one of them. Starlink has a very similar system. PWSA does. And the point here is that low Earth orbit is able to kind of get that coverage, while medium Earth orbit plays a more coordination role. We see it in another company mentioned this week, where you're able to basically get a strong connection across the LEO platform and then pass it up to MEO in order to coordinate amongst those. This kind of design is becoming more and more necessary for some of the higher throughput constellations. A lot of what we've seen so far has been sub-terabit capabilities, but we're starting to see constellations that are claiming higher throughput, like Starlink V2 is supposed to reach terabit per second, which is kind of crazy on the scales that we've been seeing. Kepler is another one that's got a high throughput as well. But this Blue Origin announcement kind of blows it all out of the water with a claimed 6 terabit per second downlink rate, which is just insane.
Absurd.
I don't even know what the heck we're sending. Like a bunch of cat pics. How many cat pics do you need to fill out 6 terabits?
We'll get R&D on that immediately.
Cat pic space announced here. So this is being positioned as a industrial backbone constellation. So we've talked about it quite a bit recently, where there's people carving out different niches for their constellations, seeing as how Starlink is kind of dominating the commercial low Earth orbit telecommunications play. So a lot of people are going to have to figure out how to add value through targeting certain use cases like maritime communications or industrial communications, or through higher throughput, higher availability, things like that.
It's very much a trade-off between cost leadership and differentiation. And you're absolutely right that SpaceX and Starlink have effectively already set the bar for what cost leadership looks like. So at this point, you're not going to be able to beat them on price. So you've got to be able to beat them in some sort of capability or customer service. You got to beat them in some other facet, some other aspect of capability that, if you're willing to spend a little bit more than the cheapest possible option on the market, you're able to get a little bit better of a product. And this is very much sort of what we're seeing play out in real time in the market.
Yeah, and that's kind of more what the Amazon Leo Blue Origin Kuiper constellation was doing, was trying to compete with that cost leadership of Starlink. Granted, with a lot fewer satellites, they had about a little over 1,000, 2,000, 2,000, so much less than the 9,000 that Starlink has. And it's interesting that there's no note that TerraWave interplays with Leo. I don't like that name. It makes it so confusing with Kuiper, because that would certainly enhance both their capabilities, but it seems like these are two very distinct plays. So it's really two different product offerings.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well, that this reads very much like it's solving effectively the same problem that Amazon Kuiper is solving, but the fact that they are explicitly not mentioned together, the fact that they're explicitly being treated in this announcement as discrete product offerings and discrete lines is very interesting. But to your point, like from a technical level, the fact that you have so many different satellites at LEO and then so many different satellites at MEO allows for sort of parallel communication. So the MEO layer, to your point, you're able to pass massive buckets of information between the two of them, massive buckets of data between them, and then go down to the LEO to actually distribute that to the end customer or to the ground station.
Yeah.
And so like, It very well could be that this is intended to sort of supplement and complement the Kuiper capability, but effectively it's a massive infrastructure investment. This is the equivalent of the Amazon or the Blue Origin toll roads, if you will, for space, creating a thorough and comprehensive set of data transfer infrastructure that is going to be made available to whatever sort of end customer is needed. So solving sort of that layer of ConOps, it looks like that's going to be something that winds up as the trend continues to go, being sort of horizontally owned by one or more of these mega constellations. And Blue Origin is making a really compelling push here to be the winner for that space.
Yeah, it reads to me like a response to orbital data centers that Starlink has claimed they're pursuing. Like this is kind of a key technology that would need to be enabled in order to do that. And it's interesting for Amazon to take this play because they already have a bunch of orbital data centers, arguably more than anyone else. So to me, it's almost like they're enabling their terrestrial data centers with this technology, whereas Kuiper was more for a commercial communications aspect. But then off of that play, they're able to expand into orbit and potentially move some of their data centers onto orbit. So really interesting turnkey technology for them. And looking forward to seeing when it launches, how well it performs. Italian space logistics specialist D-Orbit has raised 124 million in the first closing of a Series D investment round that was announced this last week. This funding is to enable strategic acquisitions, accelerate a build out of D-Orbit's orbital logistics infrastructure, expand in-orbit transportation services, scale industrial capacity for ion missions, and advance new operational capacities. This is a huge funding round for D-Orbit and a Series D, so they're pretty far along. They have launched 17 ion satellites, which is a lot. And amongst those satellites, they've deployed 200 plus payloads, which is a lot. There's not many players in orbital transfer vehicle. It's had a rocky start over the past few years. Their main competitors are companies like Momentus and Impulse Space, who are both at lower volume of operations than D-Orbit. So D-Orbit's kind of leading the pack here. They've well proven out their technology with that many launches and a pretty reliable roster of missions. So totally makes sense that they're able to raise this much money. They have a great product. I'm happy to see that some of this is going to be spent towards kind of handling the congested environment. I know they kind of started out as a debris reduction kind of company, but they've more so found their footing in orbital transfer vehicles, so orbital logistics. I think this kind of build out of their technology will help as more persistent in-orbit infrastructure is built out to avoid kind of cluttering up orbit, and rather than reduce debris, kind of prevent it from happening in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that D-Orbit has managed to maintain an almost 10-to-1 payload per asset ratio in the number of payloads that they've moved and transported per ion satellite that they've gotten up is pretty impressive. I think that's the sort of sheer unit economics of that, I think, is a big part of the reason why D-Orbit has achieved more success in what has been a very difficult market to find profitability or sustainability in. So they've done a great job of making that market viable.
Do you have any guesses as to what their strategic acquisitions might be?
I have a few guesses, but nothing substantive. I would imagine that they would be looking at potentially acquiring somebody who's a key supplier or a key provider. So if there's a key sort of propulsion player in their tech stack that they would need to solve, I'm not familiar enough with D-Orbit's tech stack to know who those players might be, but I would imagine that would be something in high demand. We've sort of spoken to in previous weeks a little bit that we might expect to see a little bit of a run on the market. We might expect to see a little bit of a run on propulsion solutions if folks are trying to integrate those tech stacks into their own capabilities. So that's one that I would keep an eye out for.
On the U.S. side, the Space Force is tapping Starfish Space to take out its trash in orbit. The military awarded the Washington-based space startup a $52.5 million contract to deorbit satellites in the SDA's Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture constellation once the sats reach their expiration date. This is a big win for Starfish Space. It's a lot of money for a contract, especially since they haven't had a huge backlog. They haven't had a huge roster of missions launched. We saw their launch a couple of years ago with the Otter Pup satellite, which unfortunately ended up tumbling very quickly once it deployed from the rocket. But in an impressive feat of engineering and problem solving, they managed to detumble it with a unique torque rod algorithm that was able to slow it down back to operational speed at that point. It wasn't a complete mission success, but it was definitely a great demonstration of their capabilities, and was followed by their success on the Impulse Space Mira orbital transfer vehicle just this last month, when they did an RPO demo of their imagery payload, and showing that they're able to approach another space object within 1,250 meters. So almost sub-kilometer approach to another object. Definitely proved out a lot of the capability to do these close object rendezvous operations. And I think that's what kind of convinced the Space Force that they're up to the task of doing this sort of deorbiting activities. What I find really interesting about this contract, though, is that SDA is spending money on a service to deorbit their satellites, when all of the satellites I've seen from York Space, Terran Orbital, Rocket Lab, Lockheed, L3, they all have thrusters on them. And when you have thrusters, you usually allocate enough fuel to do the deorbiting at the end of the mission. So it's odd to see that they're setting aside money for the capability to deorbit these satellites that are able to do it on their own, which to me kind of indicates that they're expecting some more kind of active warfare in orbit, and that this is kind of a backup plan to move their satellites out of the way to replace them in the case of adversarial interaction with that constellation.
So that very well could be the case, that this is intended to demonstrate the ability to remove something that is no longer functional. To your point, maybe one of the satellites up there is non-functional. Maybe something is actually broken on orbit. But the fact that all of these satellites have standardized propulsion and standardized solutions in order to deorbit themselves, in my mind, this is indicative more that it's sort of an announcement to the market itself. Hey, we're capable of deorbiting another satellite. Yeah. We're capable of doing that. So FAFO, we might be able to deorbit your satellite if you're doing something that we don't want you doing. So I would imagine that this is more of a demonstration of the ability to deorbit something, rather than it is a demonstration of the ability to rapidly replace something, if that makes any sense. I think this is more of a demonstration and a proof of concept that, hey, we can take your stuff out if it's not where it's supposed to be, or if it's a problem.
Yeah, it's just showing China that if they misbehave, we'll put baby in a corner. Let's follow on to our news last week, where we had the privilege of interviewing Atomic 6 CEO Trevor Smith for their new customer, Cordal Space Systems, where they're using their Atomic 6 debris shield called Space Armor to protect that spacecraft. They've just this week announced another partnership with a company called Starpath to make lunar solar farms. We talked about Starpath a few months ago when they didn't come out of stealth, but they kind of made one of their initial announcements of what their company would be working on, which was to reduce the cost of solar cells, solar power for spacecraft down to $10 per watt, which is about a 10x reduction in cost of current solar power technology. And they are positioning themselves to use that for on-orbit capabilities, but primarily they're focused on lunar habitation, being able to scale out to the size needed for persistent habitation of the moon. So this is a big announcement for them moving towards that goal, to partner with Atomic 6, who has one of the leading solar array technologies called Lightwing, which we talked about with Trevor Smith last week on our interview. It is one of the lowest dollar per watt per kilogram solar panels available for spacecraft. It has a lot of cool features like redeployability and the fact that it's fully carbon composite, so it doesn't have like metal hinges, and it can be cut to length, so they can theoretically go to any length. And that seems to be what's being leveraged here, because Starpath wants to build giant solar arrays on the moon. The design looks really crazy. They're vertical solar arrays; they just go straight up, which great for reducing the footprint of the solar farm when you're trying to fill out a small area, and it makes more sense on the moon where there's not as much gravity to pull it back down. But it looks really neat. 100 feet long solar arrays, that's longer than anything I've seen on orbit. ISS probably being the largest and one of the main competitors to Lightwing, using the ROSA rollout arrays from Redwire, which is another lower cost per watt per kilogram solar panel. So this is a great partnership between Atomic Six and Starpath, and it's a great follow-on to another one of Atomic Six's partnerships with Sidus Space and Lone Star Data Holdings to build lunar orbital data centers. And I just love seeing Atomic Six being covering the entire moon with solar power. In the same vein of lunar power generation, NASA and the Department of Energy have agreed to work together on development of nuclear reactors for the moon, as the industry awaits the release of requests for proposals, the final call for requests for proposals. So we're noting this announcement this week, even though there's no dollar amount attached or any announcement of partnership. But it is a big shift in how nuclear has been handled in the space industry for pretty much the entirety of space travel. Nuclear has been limited to very restrictive use cases for NASA for probes that go really far into deep space. Some of the lunar rovers have thermal generation nuclear reactors on board, but this is a lot larger scale endeavor, and I think a lot of people in the industry will argue that it's necessary for large scale sustainable lunar habitation. So it's great to see that this shift is happening now, so that there's enough time for us to kind of build out this technology as we start landing on the moon more frequently and have more missions out that direction. There's a few companies that I would expect to kind of respond to this request for proposal that have been positioned well to kind of take this on. X Energy being the big one, led by Cam Ghaffarian, who's in charge of Intuitive Machines, the lunar lander company, as well as Axiom Space, the lunar habitat company, and Quantum Space, an orbital transfer vehicle company. So very well positioned to take advantage of that. You can see other companies like Antares, who's also talked about building modular nuclear reactors for space. And I'm looking out for interesting collaborations with other companies like Dark Fission, who's working on nuclear thrusters for space. So I'm hoping there's some interplay between just putting nuclear on the moon and nuclear in our spacecraft. On the in-space assembly manufacturing side of things, we have a couple of cool announcements, which we're seeing this trend pretty much every other week at this point. We had the privilege of talking to Space Phoenix Systems CEO Andrew Parlick a few weeks ago about their logistical solutions to in-space manufacturing. And just this week, Voyager Technologies announced a new contract with Space Lintech to do the logistics of their new payload to the International Space Station. And this is to advance microgravity-enabled drug discovery. So Space Lintech is a Japanese company that is working on protein crystallization manufacturing capabilities to discover new biopharma compounds. So as we talked about in that interview, there's about 750 missions planned to test new materials manufactured for the International Space Station. Voyager is one of the companies that is positioned to replace the ISS once it's deorbited in a few years with their Starlab habitat. So this is a great partnership. Hopefully they start moving away from these kind of test bed payloads on the ISS towards a more scalable, production-ready technology that can fly on that Starlab.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sort of proof positive of the market itself. Microgravity manufacturing and in-orbit manufacturing at scale has been something that's been sort of just around the corner for a little while. And the fact that we're seeing folks in multiple different layers actively trying to solve this themselves internally is definitely sort of indicating that, the market is ready for these capabilities to materialize. So great to see that Voyager Technologies is helping to sort of prove this out. To sort of one of the major points and conclusions of our interview with Andrew from several weeks ago was that this space logistics is just a massive, massive market. It is not by any means winner take all. And so anyone out there sort of de-risking the space and proving out that the demand is real, that the market is real, that the customers are real, that is very much going to sort of rise the tide and lift all boats on that figurative water.
Yeah, which is probably why we're seeing so many companies announcing partnerships. And a lot of these partnerships are across multiple companies. I know we talked about United Semiconductor having partnerships with basically everybody that's playing in this space. Astral Materials is another company that's had a few partnerships announced. But just this week, they had an update for the company with their partnership with the company SpaceWorks, where they announced that they successfully completed payload build round one and are progressing on to build round two. This is a great sign that the SpaceWorks is able to manifest the forge that Astral Materials needs in order to produce crystalline compounds for their semiconductors. SpaceWorks is a space systems company, so they don't really have a particular product, although they have a few that they are kind of working on. So they're one of the products they're working on is the red capsule, and this is a launch and return capsule that they're building, which makes a lot of sense for this kind of solution. If you want to launch something to space with raw silicon material, manufacture into semiconductors, and then return to the Earth, there's a lot of value generated out of that. And having this partnership as they're still developing the red capsule will help make sure that that capsule is designed for the best kind of interplay with the launch vehicles and figure out all those logistics. And it's another trend that we've been seeing. Like Space Forge announced that they got their on orbit forge to 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is key for manufacturing the crystals needed for semiconductors on orbit. So great to see that there's progress across multiple fronts on this capability.
We also had a couple of updates in the launch segment this week. Biggest and most importantly is that Astra has shipped 110 Hall thrusters in what it amounts to an absolute milestone year for them. So 2025, they hit 45 million in revenue, break even EBITDA, and a 100% satellite engine mission reliability rating. This is a major success milestone for Astra, who's had a rough go of it since being taken private in 2024, effectively after their SPAC in 2021. They had a little bit of difficulty executing on some of their deliverables and executing on some of their milestones, and they wound up getting taken private in 2024 for 50 cents a share, a huge markdown on what they SPAC'd for just a few years previously. But this reinforced revenue stream from the Hall thrusters that they've been selling absolutely proves out the value of their acquisition of Apollo Fusion in 2021. So in 2021, they acquired Apollo Fusion so that they could vertically integrate some of the propulsion tech stack into their own IP pool and their own IP library. They wound up running into some problems with the launch side of their business, but have managed to fight their way to break-even cash flows and profitability, primarily through their propulsion business. So major milestone, huge accomplishment for them and everybody at the team who's been working on this. Moving forward, it's unclear whether or not they're going to continue forward primarily as a propulsion company or whether they're going to ultimately look at working their way back into the launch business and being a launch provider primarily themselves. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. But regardless, a huge turnaround and a major congratulations to the team at Astra for getting there and getting over the hump.
Yeah, and hopefully this goes a long way to getting them back on the launch pad with Rocket 4. They've been working at it a couple of years, and this funding is meant to kind of support the development and the launch of that vehicle, which will be a larger launch capacity than their Rocket 3 launch vehicle, which is what they were flying the years before they went private and stopped launching for a while.
Out of Australia, Gilmour Space Technologies has raised a $217 million round at over $1 billion valuation, effectively making them the first Australian space unicorn. So Gilmour Space Technologies is a launch company that has a lot of similarities to Rocket Lab's target market. We'll have to see whether Gilmour remains a specialized and sole-focused launch company or whether they, like Rocket Lab, wind up growing and expanding into the satellite, bus manufacturing, orbital solutions providing market as well, or whether they continue to focus and hammer exclusively on launch. We've seen a lot of launch companies wind up stabilizing revenues and achieving effectively a higher floor for the business operations by expanding into the satellite ownership, operation, and manufacturer side of things, which is what Rocket Lab did. So we'll see if Gilmore is planning on that path forward, or whether they want to stay focused solely on their core product offerings there.
And it continues the trend that we've seen the past couple of weeks with the sovereign launch capability, which is kind of moving at a breakneck speed this year, because we had Japan's H3 rocket was kind of going through it, but they also had the Zero rocket that they funded like 2 weeks ago. And then Canada, which is one of their first, we had like InnoSat from South Korea with their inaugural launch a month ago. We had the Canada Space was the Canada Rocket Company won their seed round, which would be Canada's first sovereign rocket, and the Ethereal Exploration Guild out of India got a Series A for their commercial launch vehicle, which is one of their earliest ones. So this is huge across multiple countries that haven't historically had launch capabilities. We're seeing movement, like strong funding and movement for all of them to get that stood up.
Next door to Gilmore Space Technologies, Rocket Lab experienced a minor setback for their Electron testing. We spoke about this earlier in the episode, but a minor setback affecting the Electron operations has prompted a couple of schedule adjustments. So this is going to be a delay to Open Cosmos's launch, which, again, preferable to the loss of any payload, but it's an unfortunate slip nonetheless. So Rocket Lab continues to balance the operational cadence with the reliability improvements that they need to make. So we're confident in Rocket Lab's ability to get back on the launch pad quickly and to avoid any sort of major slips here. But nobody's perfect in the space. Everybody's going to wind up finding and solving problems. So there's definitely an opportunity for Gilmore Space to try and cover some ground here. So on you, Gilmore.
I mean, Rocket Lab was pretty much as close to perfect as you can get. They had 100% success rate last year. I'm sure they're not eager to risk that.
Hey, they're at 100%, but why aren't they at 1,000%?
Yeah, you can always do better. Come on, Rocket Lab.
Simultaneously, ISAR Aerospace out of Germany has postponed the most recent Spectrum launch due to a couple of valve issues. They identified this problem on the launch pad and wound up scrapping the launch. So another minor setback, but should be a pretty quick turnaround. This represented the first launch out of the new Andøya spaceport in Norway, which again plays into the major theme that we're seeing simultaneously in parallel across the world of everybody trying to stand up sovereign capabilities from stern to scupper all at once. So another major announcement out of there. Unfortunately, it's not all good news out of the launch ecosystem here. Scottish rocket builder Orbex has filed for bankruptcy and has signed a letter of intent to sell to the Exploration Company, the European space logistics startup. Orbex plan to launch their Prime small-lift rocket out of Sutherland Spaceport in Scotland. The Exploration Company is working on persistent orbital vehicles, effectively OTVs, as mentioned a few weeks ago with their Redwire partnership on the Nix birthing device.
Yeah, with squishy OTVs. They got humans on them.
Very true, but the point that I want to highlight here is that this is almost in direct contrast to what Blue Origin is doing. So Blue Origin has been focusing on owning a horizontal layer effectively. That was the whole point of the discussion regarding their TerraWave, was that Blue Origin is establishing a massive layer of infrastructure. They're going to be the experts on that. They're going to own that layer, own that horizontal step in the tech stack, if you will. And what the Exploration Company is doing here is they're vertically integrating. So they're buying capability to build the rockets, even though they make orbital vehicles, human-rated orbital vehicles. So this represents something that's effectively an integration or an acquisition that is effectively against the grain a little bit. As industries tend to mature, as industries grow, and more specialists enter, the trend is overwhelmingly to see a shift from vertical integration to horizontal integration. And the reason for that is that, when you're first starting off in a completely novel industry, the first player has to be fully vertically integrated because they have to solve every single problem there. But 10, 15, 20 years down the line, the cost effectively, either literally or figuratively, of maintaining that level of best, most expertise in the world at each different layer of that technical stack throughout the entirety of the vertical is not sustainable. So you tend to see people winding up acquiring a whole bunch of expertise in one of those layers and winning that horizontal layer. So this effectively represents the exploration company going a little bit against the grain and looking at bringing on some capability and some expertise in the launch sector when they're very much a post-launch human-rated human-rated space vehicle. So a little bit of headwind that they might expect there, but if they know exactly what they're planning to do and they know what their milestones and metrics and goals are, no reason to believe that they won't be able to execute on this. But very interesting to see these two different theses playing out not in competition, but these two different sort of theses on where the market is and where the space economy is as a whole playing out simultaneously.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an interesting acquisition if they do it, because the Orbex is a small lift vehicle. It's capable of like 200 kilograms to orbit, whereas the Nix capsule that exploration company is working on is 3,000 kilograms. So this rocket's definitely not capable of lifting their whole spacecraft up there. What it seems more likely is that they're buying it in order to launch their own fuel in order to resupply their vehicles on orbit, which is a good idea because when you have people on board your spacecraft floating around orbit, you don't have to wait on the launch manifest of other companies. So I could see that being key for their value proposition, as well as they could sell any excess capacity to other companies, like launching up fuel for other spacecraft or even launching up raw materials for some of these in-space manufacturing companies we're talking about.
Absolutely. The thesis could very well be that the orbital transfer vehicle market itself, if you segment the market, that is nascent enough to where vertically integrating and being able to solve all of the problems necessary for your end customers is still a major source of competitive advantage and a major value add.
Yeah.
Additionally, Blue Origin is planning the next launch of the New Glenn in order to reuse the booster and launch the next tranche of AST Space Mobile. So they're testing both the microgravity functionality and reusability of the New Glenn launcher, and they're also getting a whole bunch of AST Space Mobile payloads up on orbit. So another big accomplishment and big step forward for New Glenn and Blue Origin.
Yeah, it's a fast pace for both of them. Blue Origin taking like a year or two between their first launch and their second launch, but now only like 2 months. And AST Space Mobile, having launched their first tranche last month on the GSV rocket out of India, already put up like a third of their constellation. So this should easily put up another third, which means they're close to completing the capacity needed for their current design of their Bluebird constellation.
Well, first and foremost, we want to offer a major congratulations to friends of the show, ISAR Aerospace. They have officially closed their $10 million seed round led by Valerian Space Ventures, and we couldn't be happier for them. The team is solving some amazing problems. They've got a wonderful tech stack, and they are one of the best companies named Samara out there. I'd put them at the top of that list, in fact. But major congratulations to the team. We're really excited to continue to follow them and see what they're able to accomplish and leverage this seed raise into towards some of the Golden Dome initiatives and some of the military and defense initiatives that their technology is so directly applicable towards.
Yeah, this is a really interesting technology they've developed. It's basically using noise canceling technology in the solar arrays of a spacecraft in order to balance out dynamic vibrations and create a really stable platform, which, as you mentioned, is really key for applications like the PWSA MDA shield, and will play hugely into Golden Dome because a lot of those infrared wide field of view cameras need long integration times, and the stability becomes a big issue, as well as tracking like really small, fast moving objects through like missiles requires a lot of stability. So having really unique solutions to this is great to see. They recently launched their first demo a month ago on the Impulse Mira spacecraft, and we're eagerly waiting to hear how that test went.
Additionally, there's a couple of other announcements that we want to run through here, but Washington Harbor expanded their space investments team with a ground services acquisition. The firm acquired Radome Services, which was rebranded as Outpost Mission Services to anchor a roll-up strategy in the space ground services segment. This is part of an ongoing wave of consolidation in the ground stations market and ground station infrastructure. And this represents Washington Harbor capitalizing on what they see as a growth market and trying to win a large market share of the ground station layer of the telecommunication needs, the data throughput, telecommunication, and infrastructure layer that's necessary for space. Currently, ground stations are one of the less well-served layers of this cake, if you will. So Washington Harbor looking at sort of buying market share and getting a sizable part of that share business-wise makes a whole bunch of sense, wanting to get that and wanting to get their foot in the door as this market continues to grow and more solutions tend to come to light. This is similar to the ThinkCom contract that was announced a couple of weeks ago as well. So ongoing trends and continuation from what we've seen so far this year and over the past several months, but interesting nonetheless. Additionally, Take Me to Space and Tomorrow.io are both playing in the same space for the most part. They're both playing in the orbital AI, orbital compute necks of the woods. And Take Me to Space has recently raised a $5 million round to scale their orbital compute network, while Tomorrow.io has announced Deep Sky AI to enable weather monitoring on Constellation. So as the orbital compute market continues to grow, we can expect to see additional companies and additional money flowing into the orbital compute, AI, edge compute, edge AI solutions, and seeing a lot of money flowing into that space. This is in conjunction with orbital data centers. So there's a chance that this winds up sort of being entirely subsumed or entirely ingested into the orbital data centers market. So for all we know, in the next 6 weeks, Take Me to Space and Tomorrow.io are going to come out and describe themselves as orbital data center companies, even though they've been doing the same edge compute stuff that we've seen in the market for the past 2 years.
Well, Take Me to Space already has positioned themselves as an orbital data center company. Tomorrow.io is more like they're a radio occultation company, so it's more, I guess, Earth observation constellation that's adding the capability of AI. But Take Me to Space is positioning their AI as a whole independent capability on orbit. And their kind of unique offering is that it's an open platform, so anybody could upload their AI software to orbit. So I see it more as like a test bed for developing the inference models that are probably going to be deployed to orbit, either for orbital data centers, just in terms of generate value that way, which make more sense as we start talking about higher throughput comm links to space. Whereas Tomorrow.io looks like they're kind of adding AI to increase the value of their service, which would primarily be off the fact that like they're generating a bunch of data just from collecting all the time, and being able to lighten the load that they have to downlink while delivering even more value is an increasing trend we're seeing amongst Earth observation companies that want to kind of lighten the volume of data that they have to move around while adding additional value to that data.
Yeah, these are both problem sets that have a well-established sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem looking at solving these problems. So there's a multitude of companies that are providing and building out a similar, not the same, but a similar sort of platform marketplace style approach to being able to find, purchase, or lease, what have you, but to purchase orbital compute capacity and use either an open source or a purchased or leased from elsewhere, or your own proprietary algorithm or AI model on that edge compute capacity. And there's also companies that are looking at sort of solving the edge compute and the data analytics. So rather than selling the data to their end customers in-housing the analytics so that they're selling the insights to their end customers. Those are both trends that are well established in the ecosystem, and no reason to believe that that's going to change anytime soon. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So for tech advances this week, there's a few that I find quite interesting. Warp Space has completed the Series C financing round through a third-party allotment of new shares. This was led by Space Frontier Fund 2, operated by Sparks Asset Management Co. Limited, with participation from existing investor Kohoko Kogyo Co. Limited and new investors Anna Trading Co. Limited, Toyota Invention Partners Inc., and MIC6 Limited Liability Fund. So if it's not obvious, they are a Japanese company. With this funding, Warp Space will accelerate the effects toward the market launch of its multi-protocol optical modem. And if you know me, you know modem's like my trigger word. I love space modems. They're calling it HawkSci, and it's digital twin system DTS. So I bring this one up this week because I find it an interesting technology, but I kind of want to talk less about the technology, more about the implications. So HawkSci is developed the optical modem to provide interoperability between optical communication devices. So we've been talking about this week after week at this point. Optical communication devices are kind of getting the day in the sun. It's also been a technology that's had a rocky start the past few years, but within the past few months, there's been acquisitions of multiple companies. There's been multiple announcements of large contracts for buying these. It seems like pretty much every constellation going up these days has optical terminals as part of their architecture. And one of the key things is that if you wanted to use an optical terminal, a specific optical terminal on one satellite and a new one on another, or you wanted multiple different constellations to be able to interact together, which going back to the PWSA stuff, I could see that very much happening, as I'm sure York Space and Terran Orbital aren't selecting the same modem or optical terminal solutions. Having a protocol that allows them to communicate seamlessly together is going to become increasingly important. And I really hope that it works out, because I love interoperability between systems. I think it requires less redundancy. That you can still generate huge value out of cooperating with other people that would normally be competitors. But this sort of inter-satellite link compatibility is really good to see. And one of the other products they're working on is the inter-satellite service that would put a few of their satellites in medium Earth orbit, allow lower Earth orbit satellites to communicate up to those for them to downlink down to the ground. So kind of what we were talking about with the Starlink tiered and the TerraWave tiered constellations. This would be a lot lower throughput, so closer to what we see with the Iridium Sat currently, but a bit higher throughput. So best of luck to them on all their efforts there. The Speedster High Visi focal plane array was launched aboard NASA's BlackSat CubeSat mission. This is a Teledyne silicon pin hybrid CMOS architecture. So that alphabet salad basically means that it's a new brand of CMOS sensor, which is a very common type of imaging sensor along with a CCD sensor. But this is a specific design that's meant to rad harden it and create better efficiency to not just to the imaging solution, but also to the computation on the back end. And this is a very special sensor because it's actually an X-ray sensor. These are fairly uncommon. They're usually bulky, cooled solutions for space observation satellites. So this would make it uncooled, a lot more efficient, just overall better. And X-ray telescopes are awesome. I think we talked recently about the Schmidt announcement to put in more commercial space observation satellites. So I can see some applications being used there. But I bring this up mostly because I think it ties in interestingly with the announcement last week that Think Orbital is building an X-ray inspection satellite. So I hope to see more applications for X-ray in uses outside of space observation. X-ray inspection of satellites is definitely an interesting one, especially given the trend of space domain awareness that we've been talking about a lot recently, but also because I think it would be helpful for things like debris management. As I mentioned when we brought up Think Orbital, there's papers that show Chandra Space Observatory, which is an X-ray space telescope, being capable of looking for debris in low Earth orbit. So I'm hoping that kind of a new technology in that area gives a catalyst to developing more X-ray applications for for things other than space observation. And then probably our most exciting news of this section for both of us, primarily Paul, is that NISAR data is now public. NISAR is the NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar satellite that was launched last year after many years of development, and many engineers sacrificed at the altar of this program, as Paul can attest to.
We did it.
So this is great to see. NISAR, as the name suggests, is a synthetic aperture radar satellite. So like the many that we've been talking about with ISAR, Umbra, Capella, Array Labs, Synspective, all of them. This is a government-developed synthetic aperture radar, though, and it's quite bigger than a lot of those satellites. It is deployed to a high sun-synchronous orbit at around 700 kilometers, and has a giant array to collect synthetic aperture data or synthetic aperture radar data, but primarily focused around ice sheets, forests, and fault lines. So this is a much more climate and nature oriented application for it, which I love to see. We have seen this a few times with commercial satellites like ISAR's flood tracking contracts and Umbra's earthquake survey contracts. But this is a publicly available data set from NASA and ISRO that anyone can use to track changes in ice sheets, which is great for monitoring global warming. Same with forests and fault lines, which is an interesting application for tracking how Earth moves due to earthquakes. And potentially, I've seen some applications for predicting earthquakes. So excited to see what people do with this data.
Yeah, it's fun to see the fruits of our labor up and operating after the difficulties that we encountered all sort of along the way. But very fun to see it up and to see the data that is now public. I'm excited to send you a printout of some of the data in high quality.
Got the inside hook. They gave you direct access password to the satellite.
Something like that. That is a wrap for the week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this has been Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert, signing off for now.